Johnston, and I was in the Air Force as an aerospace physiologist.
Very nice. And when you were there, what kind of planes would you work with?
So my first duty assignment was in Florida, and I worked with the F-15s, and then my next couple of assignments I went to was actually with the F-16s.
Which is
This one.
This
Yes.
one right here.
This is the one.
What was one of the hardest things about being the only female in the Skyjet?
I think the hardest thing for me was trying to figure out a balance between being tough and kind of keeping up along with a mostly dominated field by men, and also trying to find and hold on to like my God-given femininity without allowing it to be detrimental or a crutch. That was really hard at times for me, because if you acted too soft, you would lose respect from the men that you work with. But if you acted too tough or too hard, then you were butch, or they didn't view you the same either. So it was just a constant balancing act.
Which is understandable given the circumstances that you're in, because being tough like that, you need it, but also
You do. Yeah.
Working with guys is hard. I've experience with playing on the soccer team. You have to be tough,
You do.
but not too tough to the point where they feel like it's normal to boss you around.
Right,
Like you're
yeah.
one of the guys.
Right, and that was hard, because sometimes they would start to kind of treat you a little too much like one of the guys, and I'd have to be like, hey, remember, I'm still a girl here, and then be like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Or
So.
like the vulgar talk, and it's just like, whoa, like you're in the presence of a lady, mind you.
Yeah, I would say that back then it didn't bother me as much. I think now that I'm a mom and I'm out of the Air Force now, and I kind of changed a little bit into a different role, I think the vulgar talk would actually bother me more now, but it didn't really bother me back then too
That's
much.
interesting.
So
Because you think that I wouldn't want kids to be around this, right?
I didn't have kids. That's probably why it didn't bother me, because I didn't think about anything outside of myself. It was just whether I was offended or not, and I wasn't often offended, which actually worked in my favor. So.
That's good. Was there any time that you remember it being more challenging than the rest?
Yeah, when I moved from my first duty assignment, which was in Panama City, Florida, Tyndall Air Force Base, I moved over to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan, and I had a really hard time for some reason kind of breaking into that fighter squadron that I was attached to fly with. I think it occurred because I had previously dated somebody that was in that squadron when we were both back in Florida, and we broke up, and I think he pretty much trash talked me for a long time in the fighter squadron that I was then attached to in Okinawa. And the only way, I think it went on like that for almost a year, where it was just really difficult every day walking into that squadron. But then about a year into it, there was an aircraft mishap, a mid-air collision, and part of my job was I would be on the aircraft investigation team as the human factors expert, and one of the fighter pilots from that squadron was also there. Now, when you're on an investigation team, you are with each other for 30 days straight, and you work at least 12 hours a day, so we get to know each other pretty well. And he'd say to me all the time, Woody, which was my call sign, by the way, Woody, you're so cool, like, why don't you come around more often? And I kind of shared with him, well, I don't feel very welcome. And he was like, well, I'm going to change that. And he was one of the, I think he was a major at the time, so he wasn't like one of the young bucks in the squadron. And he actually changed the culture for me so that I was so much more welcome that final year that I was there. So things went a lot better.
That's very interesting. And the investigation that you were doing, was it a new experience to you, or had you previously?
No, that was actually my first investigation. It wasn't my last, but it was my first, and so it was intense. And the two people that had collided. One of them had been a friend of mine from my first duty assignment, so that was pretty hard. Thankfully, there was not a fatality in that one, and they both came out alive from it, but it was still difficult. So,
Yeah. If you can do, not necessarily the investigations again, but just training the fighter pilots in general, would you do it again?
In my current state of where I am, no, I wouldn't. I loved it back then. It was my passion. I loved it so much, but I don't think I could go back to it now. I've changed a lot, just with my family dynamics and having 3 kids of my own, and I'm married to a fighter pilot, and so I'll kind of let him do that, and I'll stay in my role here. But no, I don't think I could go back and do it again.
So would you, if you did, not having kids, but like if you were to just go back in time, what would you do differently?
To be honest, I wouldn't do a thing differently.
No.
I treasure my memories in the Air Force, the good, bad, and the ugly. They were incredible. I got to visit so many places. I got to go to really cool trainings, water survival and Arctic survival and the aircraft investigation teams. And I lived in Florida, Okinawa, South Korea, and then Phoenix. So I got to just do a lot of really cool stuff. I wouldn't change a single thing. Yeah.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, it was. It was.
One thing that I was thinking about when researching is, like, again, with all the traveling and stuff, is that, there was this woman who was a Christian who was doing, who would travel, and she said that it really changed her faith. And so would you think that there was a specific time that challenged your faith, or were you even, a Christian at the time?
I had become a Christian in high school, but as I went through college in ROTC, I started to get away from my faith. It was still there, but I wasn't really practicing it. And I would say that that continued until my 3rd duty assignment in South Korea. And in South Korea, they considered it basically you go and you don't take any family, which I didn't have any family at that point in time. But what that means is that everybody there lives in dorms. Nobody has their spouses or their kids there. And that was, I don't know why that particular assignment, but it was really the time that God drew me back in. I found it hard to find other females there that were also officers. There were just very few females in general, but I found it difficult to find those that I could really connect with. And so I started to hang out a lot in what they call the Sunlight Inn. It was like the church's, building where people got together for social gatherings, because there just wasn't a whole lot to do outside of going to the clubs and drinking, which I didn't do. I went to the clubs. I didn't drink. So, but I started hanging out there, and I met a lot of really great people. And so then I started to get involved in the worship team at church. And then I eventually led the worship team at church. And so that particular time really drew me back into my faith. And I think that it was a pivotal moment for me, because I had, I was single. I had dated several guys in those last several years, and it really left me feeling quite empty. And none of them were Christians. And so during that time, I just fell so in love with Jesus that by the time I finally moved over to Phoenix at Luke Air Force Base, I was single, and I had really solidified it in my heart that I had a conversation with God, and I said, if it's just me and you forever, I'm truly okay with that. Because I'd always known I wanted a family, or at least I wanted to get married. I didn't actually like kids very much when I was younger, which is funny because that's all I work with now, and I love them and adore them. But it was at that same month where I truly came to terms with God. I'm really okay with it just being me and you. And I met my husband, and he was. I had also said I would never ever date a fighter pilot again, not ever. And then I met my husband, so God thought that was quite humorous, apparently, because my husband is an F-16 fighter pilot, but he was so different because he loves Jesus also. So.
And so he had a strong relationship with God before you guys had met as well?
Yes, he did. Yeah, in fact, he is definitely the leader in our home. He's the spiritual leader. He is a strong man of God. He is an excellent father, and I knew he was different because I had gone. They do these Friday night like parties basically in their squadron bar, so they're called roll call. And when I had moved from South Korea over to Luke, in order to get my call sign, my fighter pilot like call sign name again, they had to rename me, and I had missed the renaming ceremony because my dad had had brain surgery. And so when I called into the squadron to get scheduled to fly, my husband, whose call sign is Banger, answered the phone. He started to kind of give me crap on the phone, like, well, why weren't you at the roll call? And you're new here, you need to get your name again. And I'm thinking, who is this joker on the phone? And so I decided to kind of make him feel badly, and I said, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't be there. My dad was having brain surgery. And he instantly changed into the man I now know him to be. He was just joking with me, but he said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. What's his name, and how can I pray for you and him? And I hung up the phone going, what? Fighter pilot who, in front of everybody, asks about praying for me? And so then I was intrigued. So that's kind of how things got started a little bit with my husband and I.
That's so sweet. One thing that you said was the naming ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just a little bit confused about that.
So everybody that flies, fighter pilots is where it starts pretty much, has a call sign that you go by. And it's usually, they say it's like 10% truth of a story about how you get your name. So it's either something really disgusting that you did, or something really embarrassing that you did, or just something minorly funny, but they make it into this gigantic joke, and they come up with a name. So my call sign was Woody when I was with the F-15s, but then when I went to the F-16s, they said, no, you can't keep a name that the F-15s gave you, so we have to give you a different name. So then they renamed me Bonsai. And so the naming ceremonies are a lot of fun, but they can get pretty nasty and interesting.
So going on to my next question, was it harder for you to get the job than it would have been for a man to get?
Surprisingly, no. The majority of people in my career field, which is a very, very small career field in the Air Force, the majority were women, which is different than a lot of other career fields. There are fewer females as pilots, and definitely fewer as fighter pilots. But as far as physiologists go, more women than men in that career field.
So out of all the applicants, how many did they select?
So there's typically every year between 60 and 100 applicants, and they usually only pick between 3 and 5 people that apply, and that is from the Air Force Academy, ROTC, and then Officer Training School as well. So it's a pretty competitive career field.
What was the third one you said? Air Force,
ROTC, and Officer Training. So the Officer Training course is for people that have graduated from college, and they didn't go to the academy, they didn't do ROTC throughout college, but they want to become an officer in the Air Force. And so they apply, and then they have to actually go through like 5.5 weeks of like officer training / basic training.
Do you think that women should get drafted for the Army or Air Force?
No, I don't.
So explain your point.
So I believe that God made men and women with certain purposes, and they're both valuable, they're both equal, but they are different. I think that when we start to force men to fight alongside women, it changes the way that they have to actually view us. In order for them to function and keep their mind focused on fighting in the front lines, they have to see us as the same as them. And I think that we're naturally created for them to actually feel like they have to protect us. And so a couple things will happen. If we are drafted alongside them and we're fighting alongside them, they have to either choose to do one of two things, and neither are healthy. They either have to see us as completely the same as them, and fight alongside us equally. And then I think what happens with that is when we come back home, now all of a sudden they're supposed to start treating us as women that they need to guard and protect and treat us differently. And they've been programmed and conditioned to think of us as the same. And so I really do feel like things like abuse happen more frequently when we do that. The other thing that would happen, in my opinion, is that they can't seem to just view us as the same. And so instead of focusing on fighting, they're focused on trying to protect us and guard us. And it messes with them mentally and emotionally, neither of which I think are fair to them when we're asking them to fight and be all in, all focused on it. So.
And it'd be different in the case where, like for you, you intentionally joined the Air Force.
Right.
And a lot of women do, they fight in the military and stuff for our country, but it's a different story when they get drafted.
Yeah, I mean, who's taking care of the kids mostly? I know a lot of people think that when we start to put those like stereotype roles, the moms stay with the kids and the dads go off to work. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that the feminist movement would have us believe that it's a bad thing, but being able to be a mom and a caretaker of kids is one of the most beautiful gifts God gave us. And so I think that by trying to say that it's not valued and it's not important is basically telling God that he's wrong in how he created us. So.
Did you have trouble with anyone saying that they didn't want to work with you, being a woman?
I sure did, yeah. When I was in Okinawa, I was the officer in charge of a hyperbaric facility. So you use that in case of things like decompression sickness when scuba divers would get DCS, or sometimes flying as well. People could get it, and you use that to actually fix it and heal them. We worked closely with the flight surgeons as well. So we would run the facility, and then the flight surgeons would actually do the medical treatment. And there was one particular flight surgeon who was quite arrogant, and he was about 6 months more superior than myself. And he just could not stand it that I was in charge of that facility and not him. And he made it very well known. He was mean to me all the time. And then when we actually ended up getting stationed together at my next duty, or 2 duty assignments later, and he lied about me to my commanding officer. So yeah, that was fun.
So how does that work when someone doesn't push aside their self-esteem or whatever when it comes to jobs? Because you said that he lied to your commander, so wouldn't he get in trouble if he got caught?
Yes, if he got caught, but what happened is there was no hard proof, and so it became basically he said, she said kind of game. So that part wasn't so fun, but it happens in real life outside of the Air Force too, and you just have to deal with it. But for the most part, though, I will say that the fighter pilots tend to actually work better with the female physiologists than the men. And it's because fighter pilots, as a pilot personality, is kind of known to be type A and very competitive. And when there was another man around, that's more competition. Whereas when there's a female around, giving them training and flying with them, they're not threatened by it as much. So in that regard, it was actually better to be a female.
Because they wouldn't feel like they'd be able to focus on what they need to learn instead of competition.
Yep.
So roughly how many fighter pilots did you train?
Oh, too many.
Too many?
Hundreds of them, yeah.
And was the relationship close at all, or was it just kind of How long was the training?
The training was usually just a few days here and there, and then they'd have to come back through every few years to do like a recertification. But we did a lot of different types of training, and so like the initial training was usually just a few days, as well as the certification. But then we did things like night vision goggle training and human factors awareness training, and that would go on periodically throughout the year. So, I mean, I was training them pretty frequently, whether it be a group of 5 or a group of 50. So, yeah.
It's really interesting. How much did you get to work with your husband?
I worked with him for about 7 months. In fact, the last flight that I took in the Air Force in the back of a jet was in his jet with him as the pilot. That was prior to us officially starting to date, because otherwise that wouldn't have been allowed. So that was really cool. But yeah, about 7 months, and part of that was we had actually gotten married in April, and I got out of the Air Force in August. So.
That was going to be my next question is how that works when you're working with your spouse.
The Air Force is okay with it as long as there doesn't become some kind of a conflict of interest. So, for example, I wouldn't be able to fly with him. That would be considered a conflict of interest. So, it takes a lot of focus for fighter pilots to do what they do. They do it really well. They're incredibly intelligent. They can multitask like nobody's business. They're highly trained, and if there's anything that causes them to take their mind and focus off of a very fast-moving environment, it can be detrimental. The number one cause of aircraft mishaps is human error. So.
What was the hardest thing about training pilots?
Their arrogance. Sometimes they would, not all of them, but some of them would try to argue with me over some kind of a physiological point, as if they knew better than myself. And so there was one pilot in particular that always stands out in my memory. He continued to argue with me over the difference between binocular and monocular vision, and which one we use when we use night vision goggles. And he was wrong. And I tried to explain it to him in so many different ways, and he was just nasty. It got so bad in the classroom that even his other fighter pilots were telling him to shut up, because he was wrong, and it was just ridiculous. But the arrogance could be difficult, and also they're really, really busy. They don't just go to work and fly. They oftentimes have all sorts of other jobs that they do, and then just the preparation to be able to prep for a flight that day, and then train another student or another pilot, and then debrief from it. The last thing what they want to do is be sitting in a classroom, and so sometimes that was difficult to kind of manage. It's just the unwillingness to be there.
Yeah. It's like I'm in school again.
Right. Yeah.
So what kind of vision do you use for night vision?
Monocular vision.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what's that?
So when we use binocular vision, that's like what we do here. We're using basically two eyes that are talking together to create kind of like a three-dimensional picture, right? So his argument was that when we were using night vision goggle, you actually have two scopes, right? But it comes together on one screen. But what you're seeing is a digital picture. So just because you're using two eyes doesn't mean you're still creating a three-dimensional picture. You're not really. You're just seeing a screen. And so that is monocular vision. So, yeah.
It's a little confusing.
It is a little confusing.
I would love to do more research about that. So, do you think you would have been able to do what you did 20 years before you did it?
Let's see, that would have put me back in. It would have been more difficult. There were some females in my career field that had been there when I started. They had been there for 15 years or so, but there were very few. There were more men, and as time went on, there were more females. So I'm not sure. I think I could have, because I'm a pretty tough personality, but it would have been different for sure. fighter pilots were not as accepting of outsiders as they were when I joined. You know, meeting outsiders if you're not a fighter pilot yourself. So I think it would have been difficult, but I think I could have pulled it off. So, well, I mean, we go through a whole interview process, and clearly you have to have good grades, and you have to have the right kind of degree to get into it. But yeah, it was. I felt very blessed because it was the only thing I wanted to do in the Air Force, and I got that job. So God blessed me.
I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come here, and yeah.
Thanks for having me. It was good.